Alright, ladies and gentlemen, as I promised in a YouTube short that I did on my channel just a little bit ago, as doing my impression of Carl Childers from the movie Sling Blade, here is what I came up with for an epilogue to the movie Sling Blade. Now, some of you who are watching this may be wondering, what is the movie Sling Blade about? Well, to begin with, spoiler alert for any of you who do not want your film spoiled or anything like that. So if you're one of those and you want to go watch the movie for yourself, now is the time to turn back. However, if you do not mind a spoiler, or if you have seen Sling Blade, here is what the movie Sling Blade is about. To begin with, Sling Blade was shot here in Arkansas. It was directed and wrote by Billy Bob Thornton, who also starred in the film as Carl Childers. The film came out around 1996. It also starred some other big names such as Lucas Black, who has really went on to make a big name for himself in acting over the years. Dwight Yoakam played in Sling Blade as well. Robert Duvall, known for playing as Tom Hagen in The Godfather. And Dwight Yoakam's, of course, known for his country music career. And John Ritter played in Sling Blade as well. Late, great John Ritter. Those were some of the big names who starred in Sling Blade. But it came out almost 30 years ago. It was shot in the Benton Bryan area of Arkansas. You can still go to a lot of the sites today where they shot the film. Some of the actors and actresses, such as Natalie Kennerday, I believe is how you say her last name, was from here in Arkansas. She actually used to play in some shows out at Murray's Dinner Theater. I actually met her back in 2011, and I met a couple other people who played in Sling Blade as well who were from here in Arkansas. They were in one of the scenes in the film. But the story of Sling Blade, to go over the story with you all, Carl Childers is mentally challenged, and he is being released from the Arkansas State Hospital, or as Carl calls it, nervous hospital. Say well. Well, he was in there for 25 years from the time he was 12 years old, because he had killed his mother and her lover, Jesse Dixon. Carl Childers grew up in Millsburg, Arkansas. It's a fictional town here in Arkansas, by the way, for those of you who are wondering, where is Millsburg, Arkansas located? However, Carl grew up in some very rough conditions. He grew up living in a shed that his dad had built for him. Didn't have no floor out there, but it did have a hole dug out for him to lie down in, quilt or two to put down there. His parents were very abusive mentally and verbally and physically abusive. Carl went to school from time to time. However, the bullying was real bad, and many a times Carl just stayed home looking at the ground in the shed or tinkering around with lawnmowers, working on small engines. When he was about 6 or 8 years old, his parents had a little baby boy, and they did not want the baby, and they wanted Carl to throw that baby away. They didn't want him, and Carl, only being, a little boy at that time, he didn't know what to do. He just put the baby in a shoebox and buried him in the corner of the yard. Carl only had mustard and biscuits to eat 3 to 4 times a week. His parents filled his head full of lies about the Bible and God's Word. And whenever he was in the state hospital, that's when he really was able to study the Bible for himself It took him 4 years to read the Bible. In Carl's words, "I can't understand all of it, but I reckon I understand a good deal of it. Wasn't what I expect in some places." And he slept in a comfortable bed for a great long while, had pretty good meals, and he was interviewed by some people writing a newspaper article for their school newspaper. And so in the beginning of Sling Blade, you see where Carl tells his story, a lot of the information I just shared with you. And that clip is here on YouTube as well. Carl, by bus, goes back to Millsburg, and he visits a Frosty Cream, which is like a local fast food joint. Walk up to the window, order your food, like one of them old school dairy bars. He got him some French fry potatoes. Had him some of the big ones. But Carl, after he got his French fries, he went over to the laundromat, was relaxing, taking it easy, when a boy at about the age of 12 came out with some big old sacks of laundry. Carl gave this young boy a helping hand to get his laundry home. That boy was none other than Frank Weedley. Carl and Frank talked on the way to the Weedley house, putting the wash there on the porch. And it was a great encounter. However, Carl was feeling down inside because he was unsure of how he was going to make it. And because of that, he actually went back over to the state hospital. Of course, they wouldn't let him back in. However, Jerry Wooldridge, who had been over Carl's care and helped him out over the time he was incarcerated at the state hospital, gave him a helping hand and helped him to find work in Millsburg at a small engine shop ran by Mr. Bill Cox, who used to go to church with Mr. Wooldridge. Carl got hired on there at the shop. It was a minimum wage job, and for the first little bit, Carl was staying there at the shop. There was nothing but an old army cot and a toilet back there. However, it did all right for Carl. Carl eventually, however, would meet back up with Frank and visit the local dollar store, which his mother Linda and their friend Vaughn worked at. Vaughn was a gay man who was from St. Louis. And in the words of Frank Weedley, whenever Carl was learning about Vaughn, Frank told him, "He's not funny ha-ha, funny queer. He likes to go with men instead of women." That's an interesting way of putting it. Or as Vaughn would later tell Carl, whenever he was wondering if Carl knew what being gay was about, he's like, "Now, that's a very offensive way to put it. You were taught that, weren't you?" However, Vaughn was really nice, and as the manager of the Hoochie's Dollar Store, he was able to help out Linda. Carl was able to get him some toiletries that he was needing, and Frank was able to get him a bunch of candy and a pop. However, he did not want any of that potted meat that Vaughn offered him, but Carl took some, though. After purchasing his items at the dollar store and Frank obtaining his candy and soda, Frank took Carl out to a secret place, which was out in the woods by a little body of water. That's where he filled Carl in about everything going on with his mom. He told Carl about his dad who had committed suicide, and he told him about Vaughn and how he was gay. And he also talked about his mom's boyfriend, Dole Hargraves, who was an alcoholic and very abusive towards Linda and Frank. Carl was invited to stay at Linda and Frank's place while at the dollar store, and Carl took them up on that offer, Dole was not too happy about it, even though Dole did not live with Frank and Linda. He had his own house so he could have more girlfriends, and Dole was a construction worker. However, he was very cruel. Dole always wanted to start fights with people. He didn't like homosexuals, he didn't like kids, and he didn't like, as he said, I don't like retards. I know that's he said, very cruel, but he did not like anybody who was mentally challenged. He was very closed-minded, is what I'm saying. Carl did wind up moving in with Frank and Linda. About a day or so after moving in, Vaughn took Carl out to eat for lunch and told him more about just his situation and how much Linda and Frank meant to him and his concerns about Dole being around. Later on, Dole would, in a drunken fit, throw a fit whenever he had invited his band over to Linda and Frank's house. Vaughn had came over to help keep an eye on things, and it was a really rough night that night. However, Linda, Frank, Vaughn, and Carl pulled through. Eventually, Carl would meet a woman named Melinda who worked at the dollar store, who was friends as well with Linda and with Vaughn, and they had a get-together over at Vaughn's house. Also there at the gathering was Vaughn's boyfriend, Albert, who worked over at the local funeral home. However, that night, Melinda and Carl went walking together, and in Melinda's words, whenever she gave Carl some flowers the following day, she went by the shop that Carl worked at, gave him some flowers. She talked about how she had a blister the size of a quarter on her from all the walking they did. That night, whenever Carl and Frank went to the secret place, Carl told Frank about his brother, and the next day, Dole came by apologizing for his drunken rage the night that he had his band over at Linda's place. Time went on, and Carl continued to do his work at Bill Cox's shop. One time he actually had someone bring a lawnmower in that they could not figure out what was wrong with it, and Carl was the one who solved the problem real quick, thinking the simplest things first. And the only thing it was it ain't got no gas in it. But that was old Carl, thinking the simplest things first. And they will lift a generator out of a truck that had been brought to the shop. He was able to do a lot of great work, such as fixing up a garden tiller that they had not been successful in fixing. There was talk going on about the football team at Millsburg for the upcoming school year. And Carl actually did play a little football with Frank and his friends. That was the first time he had ever played football. Carl told Frank, whenever Frank asked him if he ever liked to play football, he said, as an answer to the question, "I never was no count at it. Never did get picked out for it." However, Carl did enjoy that experience of playing football with Frank and his friends. Carl, shortly thereafter, went and visited his childhood home, the old shed that he grew up in till he was 12 years old, and visited his ailing father, who was suffering from the effects of abusing alcohol for many years. The house that his mom and dad had lived in was decaying. around Carl's father. Carl told his dad everything that he had been doing and how he had thought about killing him for all the abuse he had put him through and what he had did to Carl's brother. But he didn't do it. Shortly thereafter, one night, Carl went into Frank's mama Linda's bedroom with a hammer in hand because Dole was staying over that night. And he told them how he wanted to be baptized. Shortly thereafter, in the Sling County River, Carl was baptized. That Sunday, however, things were about to change for Carl and his friends. After church, after getting home from the baptism, Dole requested for Linda to go out and get them some chicken. Linda left, and shortly thereafter, Dole went in on a rant towards Carl and Frank, telling them how he was moving in with Linda and how Carl was no longer welcomed and that Frank was not to speak unless he was spoken to, and it was just really bad. Frank stood up for Carl and Dole tried to assault Frank. However, Carl put a stop to it, grabbing Dole's hand, saying, "Mister, don't you never lay another hand on that boy, you understand me?" After Dole had his outburst at Carl, or stand up for Frank, Frank ran out of the house into the secret place. Carl soon followed, along with all his stuff. He talked with Linda for a little bit as she had just gotten home with the chicken. He told Linda, Carl did, that he had fixed up the washing machine so they did not have to go to the laundromat anymore. Carl met up with Frank at the secret place, and while there, Carl gave Frank his books that he had left the hospital with. The Bible, book on Christmas, and another one on how to be a carpenter. He even made Frank a little bookmark in there. And he requested that Frank go to Vaughn's house when he left the secret place. After Carl left Frank at the secret place, he went by Vaughn's house and gave Vaughn the money that he had made fixing up lawnmowers and whatnot for Bill Cox. And Carl told Vaughn these words, "I don't reckon you gotta go win big